Been doing a lot of reading lately about the state of the church in 2025. And, I say I've been doing a lot of reading lately. I've done a lot of reading about that for many years now. But I know that in a lot of the things that I've heard people talk about or read articles about, some people are really worried because they feel as if the culture is turning away from faith. And that's been a worry for quite some time. Others feel like the church has lost some of the power it once had because, things like blue laws, there were other things that people kept Sunday mornings in particular as kind of holy. They didn't plan anything else over on it, and that's not happening anymore. And they attribute that to the church losing power. Others, articles that I've read, however, kind of the other side say that, people are starting to return to church after a period of COVID. There's a lot of people returning to church and attendance tends to be up. Some of that people say because folks are really looking back at the church again for answers to what feels like a sense of emptiness. So, whatever the state of the church is, and whoever is right about all of that, I've got to say that I've been feeling for some time that the church has never been in a better place. Now, I say that, but obviously the church has been in better and worse places. But I really get the sense that the church is in a really good place right now if we can recognize it and begin to move forward with it. You see, the church is always challenged by things that are going on in culture. The church is always in a struggle between who defines who we are and that kind of stuff. The church is always in that. But when we see Jesus beginning his ministry, he is taking on a religious status quo that for many had become stale, but for others was a status quo that meant everything to them. And a lot of Jesus's ministry was conflicting or having this place of conflict between those who were ready for what new God was going to begin and those who were trying to hold back on the new and trying to keep us back as things used to always be or needed to return. Now, in the very beginning of Jesus's ministry, towards the beginning anyway, in Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus beginning that ministry, and it starts in chapter 5 with Jesus' call to ministry, and he specifically calls some common laborers first. He calls some fishermen, some common working folk. He invites them to follow him. But then the very next part, he calls he calls another person to be a disciple who is a Levi, who is a tax collector, guys by the name of Levi. There's this contrast between who Jesus is calling. He is calling those who are common laborers, who are probably among the people who are trying to say, we're ready for God to do something new. And he calls a tax collector who is kind of, some would say, in bed with Rome, trying to keep the status quo the way it is. Isn't that interesting? His disciples are part of both camps. It also talks about, in chapter 5, about how Jesus heals persons with leprosy. These are people who are considered untouchable. You can't touch those people. You can't be around those people for fear you would get it. Jesus heals them. Then there's the story, which I did a couple of weeks ago in another devotional, about the friend that brings the paralyzed man to Jesus. And there, not only does Jesus heal him, but he forgives his sins. And the Pharisees are up in arms because only God can forgive sins. This is a new thing. We can't take on this new thing. And you see constantly this push and shove between moving into a new place, but also accepting and staying in that place as it once was. This is really a constant back and forth that Jesus finds himself facing. By the time we get to the end of chapter 5, Jesus finds himself in a debate with some of the religious leaders. And what happens is some of those leaders, or actually the disciples and some of the leaders, begin to question what those disciples are doing. And these Pharisees in particular say, we've noticed that the disciples of John, that's John the Baptist, are fasting, but your disciples aren't. And then Jesus goes in and he starts talking about how you celebrate when the bridegroom is present. And he, of course, is trying to connect himself with being that bridegroom. But Jesus is talking about this idea that something new is taking place. There is a new thing that is happening, and God is the one who's opening those doors. He is the one who is simply coming in and filling the new space that God is trying to move the people towards. And then Jesus uses this really interesting illustration. He says, "No one puts new wine in old wineskins, otherwise the new wine will burst the skins and be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put in fresh wineskins. No one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says the old is good." Now, basically what Jesus is saying there is he's using this illustration that they would have understood, and that is you take new wine and you put it into new wineskins that can be expanded and grow, because if you put new wine into old wineskins that are stiff and won't expand, then they're going to explode because of the fermentation process. And he's trying to say that those who have tasted this old wine, this wine that has had time to ferment, they want to hold on to that no matter what. But how do you get that old wine? You start it by putting it in a new wineskin, and you allow it to grow and change, and then it flourishes into the wine that you are really now ready to drink. This idea of wineskins is one that I find so interesting when I think about what God is doing in the church today. There are many, I think, who are trying to go back to the time of the golden age of the church. They want to go back to a time where everything was easier. Now, some of that is not really remembering all the struggles, but some of that too is just the uncomfort of the fermentation process, because we don't know what's happening in there, and things are changing, and it's hard for us to face. But if we believe that God is constantly calling us into new ways of being, into new places, we'll stop being so worried about trying to fit our ministry into some of those old wineskins. What are the new things that God is doing today? Maybe that's what we need to start doing. To stop thinking about, the good old days or what used to be, but begin to, with new eyes, begin to look and see where do I recognize God today? Where am I seeing God today? How is God moving in our world today? Sometimes you have to look a little bit harder, because you know what? We get so used to God working in one way that we don't always see the new ways that God is working. So perhaps for the rest of this week and weekend and on, let's begin to really look for the ways in which God is doing new things, putting new wine, new fresh wine into new wineskins, so that God can continue to grow the church that God is about growing.